Order. Order. We now come to the backbench debate on the Beijing Winter Olympics and Chinese government sanctions. I intend to put the time limit up to 7 minutes to start with and see how we go on. It may have to be reduced, but we'll try that to start with. Tim Loughton to move.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I presume that doesn't apply to me, but I beg to move that this House believes that the 2022 Winter Olympic Games should not be hosted in a country whose government is credibly accused of mass atrocity crimes, and calls on the UK government to decline invitations for its representatives to attend the 2022 Beijing Olympic Games unless the government of the People's Republic of China ends the atrocities taking place in the Xinjiang region and lifts the sanctions imposed on UK parliamentarians, citizens and entities. I think I must first declare an interest, Madam Deputy Speaker, as one of the sanctioned, and I wear my badge of honour today, although any financial interest I would have had to declare would no doubt have been frozen by the Chinese government. But can I thank the Backbench Business Committee for giving us time for what is a very important subject. As a spotty school student back in 1980, I proposed a motion at a local school debating competition that the UK government should not boycott the Moscow Summer Olympics following their invasion of Afghanistan over the previous Christmas, and that politics should be kept out of sport. As it turned out, Mrs Thatcher, the Prime Minister at the time, recommended a boycott, but it was left up to the individual sporting bodies as to whether they sent athletes from their sports to the Games, and those that did compete did so under the Olympic flag, and the few gold medals that we did win were collected to the strains of the choral cantata that is the Olympic anthem. My overriding memory of those Olympic Games was the image of Daley Thompson emotionally collecting his decathlon gold medal and belting out God Save the Queen to the tune of the rather dreary Olympic hymn. 65 countries carried out a full boycott of the 1980 Olympics, including such strange bedfellows as the US and Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and China. China condemned the Russians, sent no athletes, and subsequently did not appear on the medal table. So China really doesn't have a leg to stand on when it finds itself on the end of the same treatment that it meted out to its neighbour back in 1980. Now, my view on sporting boycotts and keeping politics out of sport has not changed, and that's why this motion is not calling for a fall sporting boycott, which victimises most the elite athletes who dedicate so much to compete every 4 years, however niche the UK's medal prospects might be at the Winter Olympics compared with the summer version. But the simple reality, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that in this day and age, sport is inextricably linked and is often tainted by politics, whether we like it or not, and that taint, at some times, can come no greater when the event is hosted under the Olympic banner. Most countries will bid for the honour of hosting the Olympics so they can showcase their nation to the world as an impressive player on the world stage, a land of progress and plenty where everything is just rosy and all the criticisms you hear about them are just baseless propaganda. And I'm sure we were guilty of some of that when London hosted the 2012 Olympics, and especially in the visually and financially extravagant opening and closing ceremonies, which reminded the world why the United Kingdom is the top nation. The difference was that our people were free to criticise that extravaganza if they disapproved. Our press were free to caricature or lampoon it, as some did, especially Paul McCartney's singing. And we in this place were free to tackle ministers about whether it was money well spent and whether we actually wanted it. In the same way that when honourable and right honourable members in this House are free to speak out against abuses at home or abroad, human rights or otherwise, as freely happened, including the recent reports by both the Bays and Foreign Affairs Select Committees on the Uyghur situation. In the same way that this House has spoken out about the grotesque oppression, torture and murder of over 1 million peace-loving Tibetans at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party since the occupation of 1959. In the same way we have called out the industrial-scale human rights abuses against the Uyghur people, the slave labour camps in Xinjiang, the forced sterilisation of Uyghur women, all leading to a motion unanimously passed in this House on April the 22nd, thanks to the good services of my honourable friend from Wealden, which called out these inhuman acts for what they are, namely genocide, and committed by the hand of the Chinese Communist Party government, who in just 200 days' time will be welcoming the world to the temporary mirage that is a free Beijing. As the goose-stepping battalions of the People's Liberation Army take ownership of the Olympic rings and run the Olympic flag up their flagpole. Any dissent, any protest, any adverse publicity will be cancelled, crushed, and disappeared. Just as the Chinese government tried to suppress the free speech that is the hallmark of parliamentary democracy, and to bully 5 members of this House, including me, and 2 noble lords, by responding to our expose of their abuses by sanctioning us in the misguided belief that we would shut up and go away. And now we are apparently to be subject to China's new counter-foreign sanctions law too. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the opposite was true. We have been louder than ever. The crimes of the Chinese government have been under more scrutiny in this place and beyond, as China's counterproductive miscalculation of what democracy actually counts for in the West has instead acted as a recruiting sergeant for decent people across the globe determined to call the Chinese government out for the murderous bully it really is. We should be in no doubt about the real agenda behind China's enthusiasm to host the Olympics for the second time. The Chinese propaganda machine is being ratcheted up for this historic event, which will make the Chinese capital the first city to host both the summer and winter Olympic Games. The spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Wang Wenbin, has been boasting that the majority of countries and people in the world recognise the fact that China's human rights conditions are constantly improving and China has achieved notable progress in its human rights cause, a claim that would embarrass even the Iraqi spokesman, Comical Ali, of Gulf War notoriety. We know what they will use the Winter Olympics for, as they showed quite clearly at the Summer Olympics in Beijing of 2008. They proudly boasted, with 105 heads of state and government there, it was the largest gathering of world leaders for a sporting event in world history, until 2012, that is. The People's Liberation Army Navy Band performed the nationalistic Welcome March and goose-stepped across the arena. 56 Chinese children, representing supposedly the 56 ethnic groups of ethnic China in their respective costumes, danced across the arena to the strains of Ode to the Motherland, lip-synced by a 9-year-old to the pre-recorded voice of another girl who had been told she was not pretty enough to appear on the stage. And to add insult to injury, it later turned out that all 56 of those children claiming to be representatives of China's diversity were in fact all Han Chinese. The spectacular $100 million opening ceremony lasted 4 hours and 9 minutes, as the 91,000 audience enjoyed a panoply of everything Chinese. They saw everything the Chinese Communist Party wanted them and the rest of the world to see, and indeed that was made easier by the notorious use of weather modification technology to prevent clouds and rain, just one of the more extreme examples of the Chinese Communist Party manipulating the environment. It was fated as a spectacular and unforgettable ceremony. The spectacular to end all spectaculars and probably can never be bettered, in the mesmerised words of one Tony Blair. But it was all a sham. The awarding of the 2008 Olympics to Beijing was accompanied by the International Olympics Committee promising that the Games would act as a catalyst for human rights reform in China. While a widely acknowledged genocide in Xinjiang later, thousands of Tibetans arrested, imprisoned, displaced, tortured and killed later, the snuffing out of free speech, free press and political freedoms in Hong Kong, and the trashing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and imposition of the national security law later, that went well, didn't it? To help win the 2008 Olympics, China promised to allow space for Chinese citizens to protest during the Games. Spaces were indeed allocated, but those who applied for permission to protest were in fact arrested, making a mockery of the undertakings to the IOC, and no doubt the same will happen next February, again, as China remains the world's largest jailer of journalists. The Chinese authorities... Oh, of course I will.
I'm delighted to be here listening to this extremely important speech that the honourable member is making. Would he also just recall that we had our own contribution to the silencing of debate, sadly, at the time of the Olympics, and that was the Olympics in London, when some of the so-called guards of the Olympic flame turned out actually to be operatives from the Ministry of State Security and dealt with citizens in this country, individuals in this country, rather more brutally than we would ever tolerate of our own police.
I'm afraid it's absolutely right, and furthermore to that, I remember mentioning in this House the fate of Tibetans who had been protesting, I think in the Mao, who were arrested, who were stuck behind crowds, and in some cases had their homes raided by the police and were arrested before they could go and protest as well. That's not the way we do things in this country, and yet for some reason we kowtowed to the Chinese authorities at that stage. That must never be repeated, and we must not resile from calling out those sorts of tactics that the Chinese will use in their own country and wherever they can gain influence. I'll give way to my right hand.
I'm grateful. I was just reflecting on his earlier comments, my own friend's comments, and they were about the Olympics in Beijing. We were told in 2008, as I recall, that the awarding of the Olympics would be a key moment in the movement of getting China to acknowledge and to uphold human rights to a greater degree. That was in 2008. Does he think they've made much progress since then?
Exactly the point I've been labouring to make. It was all a sham, and we all know how human rights in China have gone from bad to worse. The Chinese authorities also, back ahead of 2008, had to clean up the environment around Beijing, as it looked at one stage as if everyone would have to compete in masks. 13 years on, China remains the world's largest polluter, responsible for some 26% of the planet's greenhouse gas emissions. It's burnt more coal over the last 11 years than the rest of the world put together, and now imperils the world's third pole, the Tibetan Plateau glaciers that service the water needs of billions of people. And of course, the energy needed to produce artificial snow in Beijing for the winter sports, which they will need to do, will not exactly win any environmental award. So, like it or not, Madam Deputy Speaker, China will make this global sporting event a global political spectacle. It's incredible, frankly, that the Winter Games were awarded to China again in the first place, a sign of a much too cosy relationship between the Chinese government, the IOC, and its President Thomas Bach, who during President Xi's visit to the IOC headquarters in Lausanne back in 2017 claimed that he wanted to give the Chinese president a set of medals because he is the true Olympic champion for the youth. Yuck. But on virtually every level, the awarding of the Games to China should never have happened. It flies in the face of the Olympic principles as encoded in the Olympic Charter by the IOC. Olympism seeks to create a way of life based on the joy of effort, the educational value of good example, social responsibility, and respect for universal fundamental ethical principles. The goal of Olympism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind with a view to promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity. Sports organisations within the Olympic movement shall apply political neutrality. They have the rights and obligations of autonomy, which include freely establishing and controlling the rules of sport, determining the structure and governance of their organisations, enjoying the right of elections free from any outside influence, and the enjoyment and the rights and freedoms set forth in this Olympic Charter shall be secured without discrimination of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, sexual orientation, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. How on earth does a genocidal, industrial-scale, human rights abusing, free speech intolerant and planet vandalising regime square with those principles?
It doesn't.
In 2017, Xi Jinping claimed the international Olympic movement, in its over 100 years, has played a positive role in enhancing all-round human development, deepening friendship between nations, and promoting peace, development, and progress. Everything that China has done since then and is still doing makes a mockery of that claim if the Beijing Olympics are allowed to go ahead in the form that the Chinese Communist Party wants, and its behaviour is allowed to be normalised, and they are allowed to score the major soft power propaganda victory they crave. That's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, that a motion passed by this House urging a diplomatic boycott is so important. emphasising that again, that we will not turn a blind eye to industrial-scale human rights abuses, and hopefully impressing on the government the need to enact such a boycott so that no ministers, diplomats, royal family members and other VIPs dance to the tune of the Chinese Communist Party, and the loss of face that they will suffer will show how serious the United Kingdom is. To date, the Chinese government has taken no notice. Just last week, the Chinese tech giant Tencent's WeChat social media platform deleted dozens of LGBT accounts, sparking fears of a crackdown on gay content online and gay rights generally. Again, in defiance of Olympic principles and echoing the actions of Russia suppressing LGBT organisations ahead of the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. I will.
I'm grateful, and I apologise for missing the first few seconds of what is a very powerful speech, with which I agree with every word he's said, and he's completely right that the Chinese government intend to use these Winter Olympics as a propaganda exercise. Does he agree with me that it should be possible to turn this round if we, and I just put this forward as an example, we start referring to these Winter Olympics as something like the Genocide Games?
I think that would, if they're going to go ahead, that would be a very effective label to put on them to reinforce the point. I think the honourable gentleman makes a fair point. But back to the LGBT point I was making, remember that homosexuality was classified as a mental disorder in China until 2001. And earlier this year, a Chinese court upheld a university's description of homosexuality as a psychological disorder. How does that square with those principles, again, I quoted in the Olympic Charter? And there are also fears that Beijing merchandise will be made with Uyghur forced labour, and I hope that the British sponsors of the Games will have no truck with this if they continue to offer sponsorship, and some pressure might be applied there. But Madam Speaker, in bringing this motion before the House today, we are not alone. Through the good services of IPAC, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, and other like-minded organisations, motions are being put before the US House of Representatives, parliaments in Germany, Canada, Italy, Czechia, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Lithuania, and others. And on June the 8th, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling on Member States and the Commission to decline invitation to the Games in the absence of human rights improvement. For once, the EU did the right thing and voted for that unanimously. The US Secretary of State, Blinken, has already mooted a diplomatic boycott which has incurred the wrath of China, whilst Congressman Tom Malinowski of the House Foreign Affairs Committee has said the International Olympic Committee should not be validating the Chinese government's international standing, whilst that government is committing genocide and crimes against humanity. This coordinated effort by legislatures in multiple democratic countries sends a message that the IOC cannot ignore. If it can discuss postponing the Tokyo Games over public health concerns, it can certainly move the China Games over the mass incarceration of millions in concentration camps. In return, when celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist regime earlier this month, President Xi, of course, cheerily threatened that any foreigners attempting to influence China will have their heads bashed against the Great Wall of Steel. Madam Deputy Speaker, President Xi can bash away all he likes, but this House must not and will not be bowed. This House will soon be invited to vote on a motion calling for the UK government to institute a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics, and I hope that honourable and right honourable members vote yes, and that the government acts on that strong hint. But it must mean something, and it must lead to more action and consequences for China's behaviour beyond just a 16-day sporting event in February. The Foreign Secretary has been robust in his condemnation of industrial-scale human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and the sanctions against a small number of officials and the restrictions on businesses dealing in Xinjiang are welcome, but they must be just a small start to a much broader programme of tangible action coordinated with our allies who champion democracy and human rights. Today I've retabled my Tibet Reciprocal Access Bill, extended to apply to Xinjiang too. The US Congress unanimously passed the bill on which it's based. Why can't we? Earlier we heard concerns about the proposed Chinese takeover of the UK's largest semiconductor producer, which must surely be blocked under the powers the government has under the new National Security and Investment Act. And coming to an end now, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I know you want me to, the latest move makes it even more imperative that we have a full holistic audit of the throttling grip that the many tentacles of the Chinese state is taking in British boardrooms on British research and infrastructure projects, on British university campuses and in British classrooms? When will the notorious Chen Guangzhou, the architect of oppression in Tibet and genocide in Xinjiang, be added to the sanction list along with other Chinese Communist Party officials and politicians? But, Madam Deputy Speaker, acting on this motion today is not a discretionary option. It is an imperative, and we are duty-bound legally. The UK is a party to the Genocide Convention. All state parties to the Genocide Convention are under an obligation to refrain from taking an active part in the crime of genocide, and additionally to prevent the commission of genocide by others using all means reasonably available and within their power. This includes situations where one state alone will be unable to prevent genocide, but where its actions in combination with the efforts of others may do so. A diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics is a measure available to the UK that may contribute to preventing genocide being committed in the Xinjiang region. This is precisely because the Olympics has been identified as a key pressure point on China, and China is seeking to use the Olympics to portray a positive image to the world and has already threatened a robust response to the suggestion that US diplomats might decline to attend. Such comments reveal China's acute sensitivity to the spotlight a diplomatic boycott would shine on its human rights abuses and highlight the corresponding leverage and that the international community has. So we're therefore under an obligation to prevent and punish the crime of genocide as set down in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This House has already determined that this is a very credible case that exists, carried out by the Chinese government against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, and it amounts to crimes against humanity and the crime of genocide. In passing this motion today, we are therefore fulfilling our obligations and doing our job. I very much hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Minister will confirm that the Government will now be taking its obligation seriously and doing its job by implementing the terms of this motion, and I beg to